The warm afternoon sun felt like a spotlight, and Elara was unwillingly on stage. The sprawling lawns of the university were a vibrant green, dotted with thousands of black caps and gowns that moved like a tide of hopeful ambition. Cheers erupted in waves, each one a tribute to a future doctor, lawyer, or CEO. For my family, this day was the culmination of a lifelong investment, a victory lap for their legacy. But the victory wasn't mine. It belonged to my brother, Leo, the golden son, the one who had followed the meticulously crafted map my parents had laid out for him. I was the cautionary tale, the forgotten road on that map, overgrown and leading nowhere they considered important. My presence here was a reluctant courtesy, a final attempt to appear as a cohesive family unit, even though we were anything but. I had driven 8 hours to sit in a folding chair, dressed in a simple navy blue dress that felt both too plain and too conspicuous, a ghost at a feast held in another's honor. My father, Richard, sat to my right, his posture ramrod straight in his tailored suit, a silent testament to his unyielding principles of success and presentation. To my left, my mother, Helen, fussed with the program, her pearls clicking softly, a nervous rhythm that betrayed the serene smile plastered on her face. They hadn't spoken a word directly to me since I'd arrived, communicating through clipped remarks to each other that were meant for my ears. The traffic must have been dreadful for those coming from so far, my mother had said, a subtle jab at my decision to live in a distant, unremarkable town. My father had merely grunted in agreement, his eyes fixed on the stage where the dean was droning on about potential and promise. The air smelled of cut grass, expensive perfume, and the faint, electric tension of 1,000 dreams about to launch. But for me, it was thick with the suffocating weight of my family's disappointment. It had been 5 years since I'd walked away from the prestigious business school they had chosen for me, the same institution from which Leo was now graduating with high honors. My departure had not been a quiet disagreement. It had been a seismic event that fractured our family's foundation. I had tried to explain my reasons, my feeling of being an imposter, my desperate need for a life with tangible purpose, not just profit margins and corporate ladders. My words had been dismissed as youthful rebellion, a foolish and romantic whim. They saw it as a betrayal, a deliberate act of sabotage against the family name. The financial support they had invested in my education, a sum my father never failed to mention in his more cutting moments, was written off as a complete loss. In their eyes, I had not just dropped out of school, I had dropped out of the family, out of respectability, out of relevance. The years that followed were a cold war of silence and assumptions. I worked odd jobs, I told them, saving money. I lived simply. They imagined me waiting tables or working retail, a narrative that fit their image of my failure. They never asked for details, and I never offered them. The chasm between us had grown too wide to shout across, filled with their judgment and my stubborn, painful privacy. Now, as Leo's name was called, the applause from our section was thunderous. My father stood, his face beaming with a pride so fierce it was almost aggressive. My mother's eyes welled with tears, dabbing them carefully with a silk handkerchief. I clapped along with everyone else, a genuine smile for Leo on my face. Despite everything, he was my brother. I remembered building forts with him in the living room, sharing secrets under the covers, a time before our paths had diverged so sharply. But when he crossed the stage, diploma in hand, and his eyes met mine, I saw not a flicker of that shared history. I saw only a reflection of our parents' judgment, a cool dismissal. The ceremony concluded, and the crowd surged, a happy, chaotic flood of families embracing their graduates. We were supposed to meet Leo near the grand oak tree at the edge of the lawn, a prearranged spot for photographs and adoration. As we made our way through the throng, my father was stopped by an old business acquaintance, a man named Marcus with a booming voice and a handshake that could crush walnuts. "Richard, my boy, a proud day. Young Leo is the spitting image of you. A fine addition to the firm, I'm sure," Marcus bellowed. My father swelled with pleasure. "He's done us proud, Marcus. Everything we hoped for." He gestured toward my mother and then, with a flicker of hesitation, to me. "You remember my wife, Helen, in this." "This is our daughter, Elara." The pause was infinitesimal, but I felt it like a physical blow. Marcus's eyes scanned me, taking in my simple dress, my lack of a celebratory glow. He was a man who measured worth in achievements and acquisitions, and it was clear he found me wanting. "Ah, yes, Elara," said, his tone shifting from hearty congratulations to polite, vacant curiosity. "And what are you celebrating today?" The question was innocent enough, but in the context of my family, it was a landmine. Before I could offer a vague, non-committal answer, my father stepped in, his voice smooth as polished granite but with an edge of steel I knew all too well. "Elara is on a different path," he began, and I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. This was his arena, his audience. He was about to make an example of me. "She believes in experiences, not accolades. Leo, he understands the value of a legacy. He built his future. Elara, well, Elara is finding herself." The condescension was thick enough to choke on. He made it sound like I was wandering aimlessly through a spiritual retreat instead of living a life of my own choosing. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression one of polite pity. I saw Leo approaching, his cap perched jauntily on his head, his friends flanking him like a royal entourage. He had overheard the last part of the conversation and shot me a look that was a mixture of pity and smug superiority. My father wasn't finished. This was his moment to cement the family narrative, to draw a clear line between the success he cultivated and the failure he tolerated. He placed a heavy hand on Leo's shoulder, turning to address not just Marcus, but the growing circle of family friends and colleagues who had gathered around us. His voice rose, taking on the tone of a public declaration, a toast and a condemnation all in one. "I am the proudest father in the world today," he boomed, raising an imaginary glass. "My son, Leo, graduates with honors, ready to take his place at the top. He is a testament to dedication, to understanding that sacrifice leads to reward." He paused, letting the words hang in the air before his eyes fell on me, cold and unforgiving. "And then there is the other side of the coin, a reminder that not all children appreciate the opportunities they are given." The crowd fell silent, sensing the shift from celebration to something far more personal and cruel. "Some, sadly, squander them. They become a lesson, a family's disgrace." He didn't shout the word. He said it with a quiet, devastating finality, a branding iron of shame pressed against my skin in the full light of day. A few people shuffled their feet uncomfortably, but others, those who subscribed to my father's rigid worldview, smirked. A soft, cruel chuckle rippled through the onlookers. Leo looked down, not in shame for me, but in a feigned humility that barely masked his satisfaction. My mother's hand trembled as she clutched her purse, her face a mask of pained duty, her silence a form of consent. The world seemed to shrink until it was just that circle of judging eyes, the scent of grass, and my father's final, cutting word hanging in the air. I stood there, utterly alone, the sun beating down on my head, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just stood there, my silence my only shield, my breath caught in my throat, waiting for the ground to swallow me whole. The humiliation was absolute, a perfect, crystalline moment of agony. And in that profound silence that followed his pronouncement, a new sound began to break through, distant and rhythmic, a faint, almost imperceptible beat. A steady, insistent thump-thump-thump that was growing steadily, impossibly louder. The sound was a low, guttural pulse, a heartbeat in the sky that grew more insistent with every passing second. At first, it was easy to dismiss, perhaps a news helicopter covering the graduation from a distance or a medical transport for a nearby hospital. But this sound was different. It had a weight, a resonant power that seemed to vibrate in my bones. The dismissive smirks on the faces around me began to falter, replaced by looks of mild curiosity, then annoyance. Heads tilted upward. My father, momentarily robbed of the climax of his public shaming, scowled at the interruption. "Probably some television crew," he muttered, trying to regain control of the moment. But the sound was no longer distant. It was rapidly approaching, the rhythmic chopping of blades slicing through the celebratory atmosphere, drowning out the chatter and laughter. The thump-thump-thump became a deafening roar, a physical presence that pressed down on the crowd. A sudden gust of wind, sharp and powerful, tore across the lawn, sending graduation caps tumbling and programs scattering like panicked birds. My mother yelped, clutching her perfectly coiffed hair as the carefully orchestrated elegance of the day was literally blown away. The crowd's collective gaze was now fixed on the sky, a mixture of awe and alarm on their faces. This was no news chopper. Descending from the brilliant blue was a machine of imposing, brutalist beauty. It was a military helicopter, painted in a non-reflective matte gray that absorbed the sunlight, its form sleek and Preda. Tori. Its size was immense, far larger than any civilian aircraft, and its presence over a university campus was so jarringly out of place it felt like a scene from a movie. It wasn't hovering. It was descending, its landing gear deploying with a hydraulic hiss that was audible even over the roar of the rotors. It was aiming for the open space on the lawn, not 50 yards from where our fractured family stood. Panic began to ripple through the crowd. University officials in their academic robes were waving their arms frantically, their expressions a mixture of confusion and outrage. This was an unscheduled, unauthorized intrusion. Yet the helicopter continued its descent with an unassailable confidence, as if the manicured lawn were a designated landing zone. The downwash from the rotors was a hurricane. It flattened the grass, whipped dresses around their wearers, and sent a fine spray of dust and clippings into the air. People shielded their faces, stumbling back to give the monstrous machine a wider berth. My family was frozen in place, a tableau of disbelief. Leo's jaw was slack, his honors diploma held limply in his hand. My mother's face was pale, her carefully constructed composure shattered. My father's expression was the most complex. His initial annoyance had morphed into bewilderment, and now, a dawning sliver of fear. This was a display of power and authority that dwarfed his own, an unpredictable variable in his perfectly controlled world. He couldn't understand it, and that made him afraid. I, however, remained still. Amidst the chaos of wind and noise, a strange calm had settled over me. I knew what this was. I had been half expecting it, hoping it wouldn't be necessary, but prepared for the possibility. My hand went to the small, silent pager in my pocket, its screen dark. They hadn't needed to page me. They had come directly. The helicopter touched down with a final, ground-shaking thud, its engines whining as the rotor blades began to slow, though they never stopped completely. The noise was still immense, a constant, thunderous reminder of its latent power. A profound silence fell over the surrounding crowd, a vacuum of awe and trepidation. All eyes were on the aircraft. Then, with a smooth, efficient slide, the large side door rolled open, revealing the stark, utilitarian interior and two figures silhouetted against the light. One was the pilot, visible in the cockpit, his face obscured by a helmet and visor. The other stepped out onto the grass, ducking under the still-moving blades. He was dressed in a flight suit, his movements crisp and economical. He wore no insignia of rank that a civilian would recognize, but he carried an aura of absolute professionalism. He scanned the bewildered crowd, his eyes sharp and focused, sweeping past the sea of faces until, with an unnerving precision, they locked directly onto mine. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. He took 2 purposeful strides forward, his voice cutting through the engine's roar, amplified by training and necessity. It was not a shout, but a clear, commanding bellow that carried across the lawn with indisputable authority. "Captain Davis, your transport is here." My surname, my real surname, not the one my father used as a prefix to Disgrace. He continued, his tone urgent, professional, and completely oblivious to the family drama he had just interrupted. "The mission is time-sensitive. We need to move. Now." The title echoed in the stunned silence. "Captain." The word hung in the air, electric and impossible. I saw the confusion on the faces around me, the gears turning as they tried to reconcile the man's words with the image my father had just painted of the aimless, failed daughter. I looked at my family. My father's face had gone ashen, his mouth slightly agape as if he'd been punched. My mother's trembling hand flew to her chest, her eyes wide with a terror that was slowly being eclipsed by utter bewilderment. Leo just stared, his expression utterly blank, as if his brain had short-circuited. The diploma, his symbol of ultimate achievement, slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the grass, forgotten. The man in the flight suit, Sergeant Miller, I knew though he hadn't introduced himself, gave a curt nod, his eyes still fixed on me, waiting. It was time. The moment of decision, the final step across the chasm I had created 5 years ago. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of jet fuel and vindication, and I met his gaze. "Understood, Sergeant," I replied, my voice steady and clear, carrying easily in the relative quiet as the engines spooled down slightly. "I'm ready." And with that, I took my first step away from my family and toward the waiting helicopter, leaving behind the ruins of their perfectly constructed world. My walk across the 50 yards of grass felt like a journey across a continent. Each step was deliberate, measured. The ground beneath my simple flats felt both solid and surreal, the the bee. Blades of grass crushed by the helicopter's weight. The roar of the engines was a symphony of departure, a soundtrack to the final severing of old ties. I was acutely aware of the thousands of eyes on me. The crowd was no longer a faceless mass. It was a collection of individual, stunned faces. The whispers started as I moved, a ripple of sound that grew into a wave of murmurs. "Captain, who is she? Did he say Davis? Richard Davis's daughter?" The narrative was being rewritten in real time, and my father, the master storyteller, had lost complete control of the plot. I did not look back. I knew what I would see, and I needed to focus on what was ahead. I could feel my family's collective gaze burning into my back, a mixture of shock, betrayal, and a terrifying new kind of respect they had never shown me before. Their world had been turned upside down by a single sentence, a single title: Captain. A rank earned through years of relentless effort, through tests of intelligence, endurance, and courage they couldn't possibly imagine. While they thought I was failing, I was flying. While they thought I was lost, I was navigating by instruments and starlight. While they lamented my lack of ambition, I was undertaking missions whose details they would never be cleared to know. Sergeant Miller met me halfway, his expression unreadable but professional. "Sorry for the dramatic entrance, Captain," he said, his voice low enough for only me to hear as he turned to escort me. "Director's orders. The timeline on the retrieval moved up. We had your general location pegged at a family event." "It's fine, Miller," I replied, my voice calm, betraying none of the emotional turmoil of the last hour. "What's the situation?" "Classified until we're airborne. It's a priority 1 tasking. Your specific skill set was requested." He handed me a headset as we approached the open door of the helicopter, a sleek black piece of equipment that felt more familiar in my hand than a pen or a purse. I ducked under the massive, slowly rotating blades, the wind whipping my hair across my face. Inside, the helicopter was all function and no frills. The cabin was filled with complex instrumentation, secured equipment, and seats designed for combat-ready personnel, not guests in dresses. Another crew member, the co-pilot, gave me a thumbs up from the cockpit. I strapped myself into one of the jump seats, my movements practiced and efficient. I glanced out the open door one last time. From this vantage point, I could see the entire scene with a detached clarity. The crowd was a sea of upturned faces, and there, isolated by a ring of stunned onlookers, was my family. My father stood rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his face a mask of gray disbelief. My mother was clinging to his arm, as if for physical support, her gaze fixed on the helicopter with a look of utter incomprehension. And Leo was on his knees. He hadn't been knocked over. He seemed to have simply crumpled, his graduation gown pooled around him on the grass. He was staring at the diploma he had dropped, the piece of paper that was supposed to be his key to the world, now looking like nothing more than a discarded piece of trash. The pilot's voice crackled through the headset as I put it on. "Captain on board, all secure for takeoff." Miller slid the door shut, the mechanism clicking into place with a sound of finality. The outside world was suddenly muted, the roar of the engines now a contained, powerful hum. "Ready for ascent, Captain Davis?" the pilot asked, his voice a calm, professional baritone. "Ready," I confirmed. The whine of the engines intensified, the vibrations running through the floor and up into my seat. The helicopter lifted off the ground, not with a jolt, but with a smooth, inexorable ascent. We rose straight up, climbing above the oak tree, above the bell tower, above the entire university that had been the backdrop for my humiliation. I looked through the reinforced window. The figures on the lawn shrank with terrifying speed. My family became small, indistinct shapes, their drama, which had felt so all-consuming just minutes ago, now reduced to a tiny, insignificant diorama. I watched until the university was just a collection of buildings, and the people were no more than specks. The pilot banked the helicopter, and we soared away, leaving the manicured lawns and shattered certainties behind. Inside the cabin, Miller handed me a tablet, its screen already glowing with encrypted data. "Your mission briefing, Captain," he said. The shift was immediate. The daughter, the disgrace, the sister, those roles fell away like a shed skin. I was Captain Elara Davis of the Air Force, and I had a job to do. My mind instantly compartmentalized, pushing the raw emotion of the last hour into a locked box. There would be time for that later. Maybe. Now there was only the mission. I began to read, my eyes scanning the technical details, orbital mechanics. and satellite trajectories. The world of family politics and personal slights dissolved, replaced by the clean, cold logic of physics and strategy. As we flew on, the setting sun painting the horizon in streaks of orange and purple, I felt a profound, aching sense of release. It wasn't triumph or revenge. It was something quieter, more complex. It was the bittersweet taste of freedom. The helicopter had not been a grand gesture of defiance I had planned. It was simply my life, my reality, intersecting with theirs in the most spectacular way possible. They had written me out of their story, and in doing so, they had missed the entire plot of mine. Now, they were left on the ground with the wreckage of their assumptions, while I was exactly where I was supposed to be, in the air, heading towards the unknown, a captain of my own destiny. The life they had called a failure had just been revealed as something they couldn't even comprehend. And as the campus disappeared behind us, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that I would never be defined by their small, earthbound world again. The immediate aftermath on the ground was a vortex of silence and confusion. The thunderous roar of the helicopter faded into the distance, leaving a ringing void in its place. For a long moment, nobody moved. The thousands of guests and graduates stood frozen, their eyes turned toward the empty sky where the gray machine had vanished. The wind settled, the scattered programs lay still on the grass, and the afternoon sun seemed to have lost its warmth. All the energy, all the joy of the celebration had been sucked out of the air, replaced by a palpable sense of shock and disbelief. Then, as if a spell had been broken, every single head turned in unison. Not towards the stage, not towards the university officials now huddled in a panicked group, but towards the small, isolated cluster of people near the grand oak tree. My family. Richard, Helen, and Leo were no longer just another proud family. They were the epicenter of a mystery, the subjects of intense, burning curiosity. The public humiliation my father had so expertly orchestrated had boomeranged with a force he could never have anticipated. He was no longer the patriarch delivering a moral lesson. He was the fool who had just publicly disowned a military captain. The first to break the silence was Marcus, the booming-voiced business acquaintance. He took a hesitant step toward my father, his face a canvas of bewilderment. "Richard, Captain, what was that for her?" His voice was a fraction of its former volume, laced with an awe that bordered on fear. My father couldn't answer. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The certainty and authority had been stripped from him, leaving behind a frail, bewildered old man in an expensive suit. His entire worldview, a rigid structure built on wealth, status, and academic pedigrees, had just been demolished by a machine he couldn't comprehend and a title he hadn't bestowed. My mother began to sob, not the delicate, controlled tears of pride she had shed for Leo, but harsh, ragged gasps of shock. "What was that? Richard, who was that? What is she doing?" she pleaded, her voice cracking. She looked at her husband for answers, for the reassurance that he was still in control, but he had none to give. His silence was the most terrifying answer of all. And then there was Leo. He finally pushed himself up from the ground, his face streaked with dirt where he had knelt. He picked up his diploma, the crisp paper now crumpled and soiled. He stared at it, this symbol of his triumph, and it seemed to mock him. His entire life had been a race to earn his father's approval, a race he had won today. He had followed every rule, checked every box, and secured his place as the heir apparent. But in the span of 5 minutes, his sister, the family footnote, the cautionary tale, had completely eclipsed him. Her life, which he had pitied, was suddenly revealed to be one of consequence, of high-stakes importance that made his business degree feel like a child's toy. The crowd began to close in, not with malice, but with an insatiable need for answers. Friends of my parents, Leo's classmates, even university faculty members, all approached them with questions. "We had no idea Elara was in the military." "Captain, that's incredible. What branch is she in? Why was it all such a secret?" Each question was a fresh stab at my father's pride. To admit he didn't know was to admit he had been so absent from his daughter's life that she could achieve a rank of command in the United States Air Force without his knowledge. To admit he did know would be to confess that he had deliberately lied, calling her a disgrace while knowing she was a decorated officer. There was no good answer. He was trapped. He grabbed my mother's arm. "We're leaving," he rasped, his voice hoarse. He began to push his way through the crowd, his head down. avoiding eye contact. People parted for him, their questions dying on their lips as they saw the look of utter devastation on his face. Leo followed numbly behind them, a ghost in his own celebration. The congratulations of his friends sounded hollow, their slaps on the back felt like blows. His victory had turned to ash in his mouth. The walk to the car park was the longest of their lives. Every whisper they passed felt like a condemnation. The stairs followed them, a silent jury delivering its verdict. The family that had arrived radiating pride and success was now scurrying away like outcasts, shrouded in shame and confusion. When they finally reached their luxury sedan, the silence within the car was more deafening than the helicopter's roar. My father gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed on nothing. My mother stared out the window, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. Leo sat in the back, the crumpled diploma on the seat beside him, a worthless prop from a play where he was no longer the star. The carefully curated image of the perfect Davis family, an image they had spent a lifetime cultivating, had been irrevocably shattered. And it had been shattered not by an enemy or a rival, but by the daughter they had so thoroughly underestimated, the failure who had, in the most public and spectacular way imaginable, left them all behind. The truth was out, not because I had revealed it, but because my duty had called. Their shame was not my revenge, it was simply the consequence of their own blindness. Inside the helicopter, the world transformed. The emotional turbulence of the graduation faded, replaced by the sterile focus of the mission. The tablet in my hands was a portal to a different universe, one governed by physics, strategy, and the unforgiving calculus of national security. The mission was a dark bird recovery. A highly classified reconnaissance satellite had suffered a critical malfunction and was on an unscheduled, uncontrolled deorbit. Its trajectory predicted it would break up over a remote, unpopulated stretch of the northern wilderness, but several key components, including its primary sensor array and its encrypted data core, were designed to survive re-entry. My job was to lead the team that would get to those components before anyone else did. My specific skill set, as Miller had mentioned, was advanced orbital tracking and rapid response logistics. Before I became a pilot, my initial training was in astrophysics and engineering. I could predict debris scatter patterns with a high degree of accuracy and coordinate a multi-asset recovery operation in real time. It was a niche, high-pressure field, and I was one of the best. The irony was not lost on me. My father, a man who worshipped at the altar of business and finance, could never grasp the complexities of my work. His world was one of profits and losses, of tangible assets and market shares. Mine was a world of telemetry data, atmospheric drag, and the silent, deadly dance of objects moving at 20,000 miles per hour. For the next hour, I was completely absorbed. I spoke with Mission Command via secure satellite link, conferred with the meteorological officer about upper atmosphere wind shear, and coordinated with the ground recovery teams who were already en route to the projected impact zone. The co-pilot, a young but brilliant lieutenant named Sanchez, occasionally glanced back at me, a look of professional respect in his eyes. He knew my reputation. In this world, the world that mattered to me, I was not a disgrace. I was a commander. I was trusted. It was only when we had a temporary lull, as we refueled midair from a tanker plane over a sea of clouds, that my thoughts drifted back to the manicured lawn I had left behind. The locked box of emotions I had set aside began to rattle. I closed my eyes, and the image of my father's ashen face, my mother's tears, and Leo's crumpled form flooded my mind. There was no triumphant surge of "I showed them." Instead, a profound and hollow sadness washed over me. I had not enlisted to spite them. I had enlisted to save myself. The world of business school had felt like a cage, a life path that was slowly suffocating my soul. I craved purpose, structure, a challenge that was real and consequential. The Air Force had given me that. The training had been the hardest thing I had ever done. I had been pushed to my physical and mental limits, broken down and rebuilt. There were nights in officer training school when I was so exhausted and lonely that I nearly quit, my parents' mocking voices echoing in my head, telling me I was throwing my life away. But I didn't quit. I found a strength I never knew I possessed. I discovered I had a mind suited for complex problems and a spirit that thrived under pressure. I kept it a secret from them for a simple reason. I knew they wouldn't understand, and worse, they would try to interfere. They would have seen T as another failure, a step down from the corporate royalty they had envisioned for me. They would have tried to talk sense into me, to use their influence to get me an easier assignment, fundamentally missing the point that the difficulty was what I craved. So I let them believe what they wanted. I let them think I was drifting, working menial jobs. It was easier than fighting them. It was a lie of omission, a wall I built to protect my new life from their judgment. I had told myself it didn't matter what they thought. But standing on that lawn, hearing my father's pronouncement, I realized how much it still hurt. The little girl inside me who had desperately wanted her father's approval was still there, and his words had been a dagger to her heart. The helicopter was my life now, a life of immense responsibility and purpose, but it was also a life of isolation. The missions were classified, the hours were grueling, and the friendships I formed were forged in high-stakes environments that civilians could never comprehend. I had a family in my squadron, a band of brothers and sisters bound by shared duty and risk. But it wasn't the same. The departure from the graduation wasn't just a dramatic exit. It was a final, painful acknowledgement that the family I was born into and the family I had chosen could never coexist. They existed in different universes, speaking different languages. My success was written in a script they would never be able to read. "Captain," Sanchez's voice broke through my reverie. "We're 5 minutes out from the initial search perimeter. Ground teams are in position." I blinked, the sadness receding as my training took over. I was back in the moment, the mission my anchor. "Roger that, Lieutenant," I said, my voice crisp and clear. "Take us down to 500 feet. I want a visual sweep before we deploy the ground sensor." I looked out the window again, but this time I wasn't looking back. Below us was a vast, unbroken expanse of rugged wilderness, a world of sharp peaks and deep shadows, beautiful and dangerous. It was a landscape that demanded respect, a place where a person's worth was measured not by their last name or their diploma, but by their skill, their courage, and their ability to get the job done. This was my world now. And as we descended into the wild, I felt a sense of belonging, a feeling of being exactly where I was meant to be, that I had never once felt in the manicured, predictable world of my father. The sadness was still there, a quiet ache in my chest, but it was overshadowed by a powerful sense of purpose. The girl who was a disgrace was gone. The captain was on duty. The days that followed the graduation were a slow-motion implosion for the Davis family. The story of the mysterious helicopter and the secret captain daughter became the stuff of local legend, a piece of gossip so delicious and so shocking that it spread through their social and professional circles like wildfire. My father, Richard, a man who prided himself on his control and his pristine reputation, found himself in an untenable position. At his country club, at board meetings, on the golf course, the questions were relentless. They were phrased politely, of course, couched in feigned admiration, but the subtext was clear. How could you not know? And if you did know, why did you treat her that way? His old friends, men like Marcus, now looked at him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. His narrative of the failed daughter was not just wrong, it was a lie, and a deeply cruel one at that. His authority, which was built on a foundation of unassailable success and shrewd judgment, began to crumble. How could his business insights be trusted if his judgment about his own child was so spectacularly flawed? He tried to spin the story, of course. In the beginning, he attempted to claim it was all a surprise to him as well, that Elara was a private person. But that only made him look foolish and disconnected. Then he tried to co-opt my success, hinting vaguely about sensitive government work and the need for family discretion, as if he had been a knowing, silent partner in my secret career all along. But no one believed him. They had all been there. They had seen his face. They had heard him call me a disgrace with his own mouth. The lie was too big, the public evidence too damning. For the first time in his life, Richard Davis was not in control of the story, and the impotence was eating him alive. My mother, Helen, retreated into the house, a prisoner in her own home. The calls from her friends in the charity leagues and social committees stopped being about congratulations for Leo and started being intrusive, probing inquiries about me. She had no answers. Her life had been dedicated to maintaining the family's image, a task that now seemed impossible. She would wander through the quiet, oversized house, wringing her hands, replaying the scene on the lawn over and over. Her complicit. Why in my public shaming? her silent endorsement of my father's cruelty, now felt like a heavy shroud she couldn't shake off. She had chosen her husband's pride over her daughter's dignity, and the memory haunted her. Leo bore the brunt of the fallout in a different way. He started his prestigious new job at a top investment firm, the position he had worked his entire life for. But the gloss was gone. His colleagues whispered about the graduation story. He was no longer just Leo Davis, the brilliant new hire. He was Leo Davis, the guy whose sister is some kind of secret agent. His own achievements felt diminished, overshadowed by a sister he had spent years pitying. The smug certainty that had defined him was replaced by a gnawing insecurity. He had played the game perfectly, followed all the rules, and yet I, the rule breaker, had somehow won in a way he couldn't comprehend. He started to question everything: his career path, his father's values, his own identity. Was he just a product of his father's ambition? What did he actually want? The more he thought about it, the more he realized he didn't know. He tried to find out about me. He scoured the internet, searched military databases, but came up with almost nothing. My records were sealed, my assignments classified. The lack of information only fueled the mystery and his own sense of inadequacy. One evening, about a week after the graduation, the tension in the house finally snapped. Leo found his father in the study, staring at an old family portrait taken when we were children, a time before the cracks had begun to show. "I don't understand, Dad," Leo began, his voice strained. "Why did you do it? Why did you say that about her in front of everyone?" Richard didn't turn around. "She made her choices," he said, his voice flat and brittle. "She chose to throw away everything we gave her." "Threw it away," Leo's voice rose, laced with a hysteria he couldn't contain. "She's a captain in the Air Force. She's commanding missions with helicopters. That's not throwing things away. That's incredible. And we didn't even know." "You called her a disgrace. You made us all look like fools." "She made me look like a fool," Richard finally roared, spinning around, his face contorted with a rage that was born of pure humiliation. "She did it deliberately. That whole spectacle, landing a helicopter in the middle of your graduation. It was a calculated move to embarrass me." "You think she planned that?" Leo asked, incredulous. "You think the military dispatches helicopters as a party trick? Do you hear yourself?" The argument escalated, years of unspoken resentments and frustrations pouring out. Helen rushed in, trying to mediate, but both men were beyond reason. It was a torrent of blame and recrimination. Leo accused his father of being a tyrant, obsessed with image and control. Richard accused Leo of being ungrateful, of not appreciating the perfect life that had been handed to him. In the end, Leo stormed out, shouting that he needed space, that he couldn't live in that house anymore. The front door slammed shut, leaving Richard and Helen standing in the cavernous silence of their perfect home, the family portrait on the wall a mocking reminder of a unity that no longer existed. The foundation had not just been fractured, it had completely collapsed, and they were left alone to sift through the rubble of their pride. 2 weeks after the recovery mission, which was a success, I was granted a few days of downtime at a domestic base. It was there that I received a message, routed through the Air Force's official communication channels. It was a formal request for contact from my parents. My commanding officer, a woman I respected immensely, called me into her office. "Captain," she said, her expression neutral, "you're under no obligation to respond. If you consider this a personal matter that could compromise your focus, we can block any further communication." For a moment, I was tempted. It would be so easy to cut the cord completely, to leave them in the silence they had imposed on me for years. But something stopped me. Perhaps it was a flicker of that old familial duty, or perhaps it was the need for a different kind of closure, not the dramatic departure, but a quiet, final conversation on my own terms. I agreed to a meeting. I chose the location, a small, unassuming diner off a highway, halfway between the base and their city. It was neutral territory, a place with no history, no ghosts. When I walked in, they were already there, sitting in a booth by the window. They looked older, more tired than they had at the graduation. My father's expensive suit had been replaced with a simple polo shirt, but he still looked profoundly uncomfortable, like a king forced to sit amongst commoners. My mother clutched her coffee cup as if it were a life raft. I slid into the booth opposite them. The vinyl was cracked, and the air smelled of stale coffee and fried bee. "Second," the silence stretched, thick and awkward. A waitress came over and we all ordered coffee, a small ritual of normalcy in a situation that was anything but. My father spoke first, his voice stilted, rehearsed. Elara, we wanted to see you, to talk. I just looked at him, waiting. The ball was in his court. I would not make this easy for him. We were surprised, my mother chimed in, her voice thin and reedy. We had no idea. A captain, it's very impressive. The word hung there, impressive. Not we're proud of you, not we're sorry, but impressive. It was a word one used to describe a business acquisition or a stock portfolio's performance. It was an acknowledgement of my value, not my humanity. Why didn't you tell us? My father asked, his tone a mixture of genuine curiosity and accusation. You let us believe you were struggling. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was bitter, but it helped to ground me. Would you have believed me? I asked, my voice quiet but firm. Or would you have told me I was making another mistake? Would you have tried to talk me out of it, tell me it was beneath me, that it wasn't the right path? His silence was my answer. He knew, and I knew that was exactly what he would have done. The things you said, Dad, I continued, looking him directly in the eye. At the graduation, you said them in front of everyone. You called me a disgrace. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't remorse, not yet. It was something closer to shame, the shame of being caught, of having his own cruelty exposed. I was emotional, he stammered, a weak excuse. Leo's big day. I was proud of him. I was disappointed in the choices you made. You weren't disappointed in my choices, I corrected him gently. You were disappointed I didn't make your choices. You've never seen me, Dad. You've only ever seen a reflection of yourself and your ambitions. When that reflection didn't look exactly the way you wanted, you declared it broken. My mother started to cry softly. We love you, Elara, she whispered. We just wanted the best for you. You wanted the best for the family name, I said, my voice hardening slightly. You wanted a daughter who would fit into your world. I couldn't be that person, so I went and found a world where I did fit. A world where my worth is measured by my actions, not my last name. A world you know nothing about. I laid my hands flat on the table. This was the moment. The reason I had come. I didn't agree to this meeting for an apology because, frankly, I don't think you're capable of giving a real one. An apology would require you to admit you were wrong, and your pride would never allow that. I came here to tell you that I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done. I'm done trying to win your approval. I'm done being your disappointment. I am Captain Elara Davis of the United States Air Force. I have a life, a purpose, and a family that respects me for who I am. I don't need anything from you. My father stared at me, his face a battleground of conflicting emotions, anger, confusion, and a dawning, terrifying understanding of what he had lost. He had wanted a daughter he could control, and instead he had raised a commander he couldn't even comprehend. He finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. So what now? Now, I said, placing a few dollars on the table for the coffee, I go back to my life, and you go back to yours. I slid out of the booth. I looked at them one last time, these two people who were my biological parents but who had become strangers to me. There was no hatred in my heart, only a vast, empty space where a daughter's love used to be. Goodbye, I said. It was not a goodbye for now. It was a goodbye for good. And as I walked out of the diner and into the bright, clear sunshine, I didn't look back. I felt no triumph, only the quiet, solemn finality of a chapter closing. The true victory wasn't the helicopter or the public reversal. It was this moment. The moment I realized I didn't need them to forgive me or accept me or even understand me. The moment I finally, completely, set myself free. Life moved on as it always does. I returned to my duties, immersing myself in the demanding rhythm of my career. The sky became my home, the cockpit my office, the hum of the engines the steady beat of my new life. My squadron was my family. We saw each other through long deployments, celebrated promotions, and mourned losses. They knew me as Captain Davis or just Elara. They didn't know about the grand house I grew up in, or the business school I'd abandoned, or the father who had called me a disgrace. They knew me by my skill as a pilot, my calm under pressure, my loyalty to the people who flew beside me. Here, my past was irrelevant. My present was all that mattered. I never spoke to my parents again. I heard, through a distant aunt who sent a Christmas card every year, that things had changed for them. My fath. Had taken an early retirement, stepping away from the corporate world he had so long dominated. The fire seemed to have gone out of him. My mother became more reclusive, focusing on her garden. The aunt's letter mentioned that the grand house felt empty, that Leo rarely visited. He had left his high-paying job after only a year and had moved to a smaller city out west, trying to find himself, as my father had once so mockingly said of me. Leo sent me an email once, about a year after our last meeting. It was long and rambling, a confession and an apology all in one. He wrote about the immense pressure he had always felt, the suffocating need to live up to our father's expectations. He admitted he had been jealous of my courage to walk away, even as he had scorned me for it. He said the graduation had been a wake-up call, forcing him to see how hollow his own ambitions were. He was working for a nonprofit now, building houses. He said he was finally happy. He asked if we could talk sometime. I wrote back a short, simple email. "I'm glad you're happy, Leo. I wish you all the best." I didn't offer to talk. The wound was too deep, the years of distance too great. Forgiveness was a complex terrain, and I wasn't ready to navigate it. Perhaps someday, but not now. My path was forward toward the horizon. One evening, years later, I was standing on the tarmac of a remote airfield, the desert air cool and crisp against my skin. The stars were a brilliant, blazing canopy overhead, unobscured by city lights. We were preparing for a night flight, a routine training exercise. As I did my pre-flight check, my mind drifted back to that sunny afternoon at the university. I thought of the shame, the hurt, and the sudden, thunderous arrival of my other life. The memory no longer brought a sting of pain, but a quiet, reflective melancholy. It was a pivotal moment, a violent collision of my two worlds that had ultimately allowed me to leave one behind for good. I sometimes wondered what would have happened if that helicopter hadn't been called, if my secret had remained a secret. Would I have eventually broken under the weight of my father's disappointment? Would I have spent my life feeling like a failure? I would never know, but I was grateful. Grateful for the life I had built, for the purpose I had found. My empowerment hadn't come from shaming my family. It had come from the quiet, lonely years of hard work that no one saw. The helicopter was not the victory itself. It was merely the moment the scoreboard was finally revealed. My co-pilot came up beside me, handing me a flask of hot coffee. "Beautiful night, Captain," he said, his gaze also on the stars. "That it is, Lieutenant," I replied, a genuine smile on my face. "That it is." I took a sip of the coffee, its warmth spreading through my chest. I looked at the powerful, beautiful machine waiting for me on the tarmac, its engines silent but ready. It was more than a helicopter. It was a symbol of my escape, my transformation, my truth. The world my parents had designed for me was small, confined by walls of expectation and status. But the world I had chosen for myself was as vast and limitless as the night sky above me. There was sadness in what I had lost. A family, a brother, a childhood home filled with memories now tainted. Growth is not without its costs, and freedom sometimes leaves scars. But as I climbed into the cockpit and my hands moved over the familiar controls, I felt no regret. I was not their disgrace. I was not their captain. I was simply Elara, and I was home. The engines roared to life, and I prepared to take flight, rising above the shadows of the past and into the endless, starlit promise of the future.